There is a peculiar thing that happens when we study history's most violent men. We look for the wound. We search, almost instinctively, for the moment, the rupture, the loss, the humiliation. That might explain how an ordinary human being crossed from cruelty into something altogether darker. And sometimes we find it. Sometimes the story makes a horrible kind of sense. But then there are figures like Edward Lowe, and the story refuses to cooperate. Lowe was not the most famous pirate of the Golden Age. That distinction, rightly or wrongly, tends to fall to Blackbeard, a man whose legend was built as much on theatre as on terror. Nor was Lowe the wealthiest, nor the most strategically brilliant. What set Edward Lowe apart, what earned him his singular and dreadful reputation among sailors, captains, and coastal communities from the Caribbean to the coasts of New England, was something far simpler and far more disturbing. He was the cruelest, not by a small margin, by a distance that left his contemporaries, hardened men, pirates themselves, genuinely unsettled. In an era when violence was currency, when brutality was practically a professional requirement, Edward Lowe found ways to shock people who had already seen everything. He was born around 690, most likely in Westminster, London, a city that in those years was a great churning machine, consuming the poor and the unlucky in equal measure. The details of his childhood are thin, as they so often are for men of low birth in that century. What we know is painted in broad strokes. A difficult upbringing. An older brother, who reportedly taught the young Edward to pick pockets in the crowded lanes around Covent Garden, and an early apprenticeship in survival that left little room for softness. London in the late 17th century was not kind to boys without money. It taught them, very efficiently, that the world had no particular interest in their well-being. He eventually made his way across the Atlantic, as so many did in those years, drawn by work, by desperation, or simply by the desire to be somewhere else entirely. He found employment in the shipyards of Boston working the rigging trade, and for a brief and remarkable period, the historical record shows us something almost tender. He married. He had a child, a daughter, and then his wife died in childbirth, and the daughter was taken in by others, and Edward Lowe, whatever fragile architecture had been holding him together, appears to have let something go. Now, we must be careful here. History invites us to draw a straight line between that grief and what came next, and perhaps that line exists. Perhaps the loss of his wife was the stone dropped into still water, and everything that followed was the ripple. But we should resist the comfort of that explanation, because plenty of men have known grief and not become what Edward Lowe became. Grief does not explain the particular quality of his violence, the inventiveness of it, the apparent relish. Something else was always there, waiting. The grief may simply have removed whatever was keeping it quiet. By 1722, Lowe had graduated from petty theft and labor disputes. He had, in fact, tried to shoot a superior officer after a disagreement over pay, missed, and promptly stolen a boat, to full-throated piracy under the command of George Lowther. He learned quickly. He was bold to the point of recklessness, and, within a remarkably short time, he had his own ship, his own crew, and his own flag. A red skeletal figure on a black field, which sailors who spotted it on the horizon understood, with a cold certainty, to mean something far worse than mere robbery. What followed was roughly 2 years of sustained, almost energetic terror across the Atlantic seaboard and beyond. He captured dozens of vessels. He tortured captains. He mutilated prisoners in ways that his contemporaries took care to document, because they understood that the world should know what this man was. He inspired a specific kind of fear, not the generalized fear of pirates, but a personal, particular dread. Sailors did not merely hope to avoid Edward Lowe. They prayed for it, and then, as suddenly as he had appeared, he was gone. The historical record goes quiet. No confirmed execution, no burial at sea, no final act. He simply vanishes from the pages of the documented world, sometime around 1724, leaving behind him a legacy of documented horror and an enduring mystery about how it ended. This is his story. We will take it slowly. There is no need to rush, and the darkness, as you will find, is worth understanding. There is a version of Edward Lowe's story that begins with the sea, with salt air and rigging, and the particular freedom that open water offers a man with nothing left to lose. It is a romantic version, and it is not entirely wrong. But before the sea there was Boston, and before Boston there were years of quiet accumulation, of small indignities, small failures, and the gradual erosion of whatever hope a man of Lowe's circumstances might have reasonably carried with him across the Atlantic. He arrived in Boston sometime in the early 1710s, though the precise year, like so much of his early life, declines to be pinned down. What we know is that he came as a working man, skilled enough with rope and rigging to find employment in the shipyards that lined the harbor. Boston in those years was a prosperous, busy, quietly stratified city. Ships arrived and departed in a constant rhythm. Money moved, upward mostly, as it tends to do, and the men who worked the docks and the yards and the warehouses lived lives of persistent, unglamorous labor, close enough to the wealth being generated around them to feel its warmth, but never quite close enough to touch it. Lowe worked. He married a woman named Eliza Marble, and here the record does something unexpected. It softens briefly and shows us a man who appears to have wanted ordinary things: a home, a family, some foothold in the world. His daughter was born, and then Eliza died, likely from complications of that very birth. And the child, whom Lowe apparently loved, in his way, was placed with relatives or neighbors. The record is not entirely clear. What is clear is that Lowe did not raise her, that the brief domestic chapter of his life closed almost as soon as it had opened. What happened to him in the months after that loss we cannot say with precision. Men in grief do not always announce their intentions, but the Edward Lowe who reappears in the historical record shortly thereafter is a noticeably sharper, more volatile creature. He is working on a vessel out of Boston, engaged in the timber trade in the Bay of Honduras, honest work, or honest enough by the standards of the era. And it is here, in the sticky heat of a Central American bay, over what began as a dispute about nothing more consequential than a meal, that the fuse is finally lit. The story, as recorded by Captain Charles Johnson in his invaluable, if occasionally embellished, General History of the Pirates, goes like this. Lowe and a small group of crewmen were sent ashore in a longboat to cut logwood. They returned to the ship hungry and requested food before returning to work. The captain refused. Words were exchanged. Lowe, who was not a man who accepted refusals gracefully, picked up a loaded musket and shot at the captain. He missed. The ball struck another man, wounding him, and the consequences of that impulsive, furious moment became immediately, catastrophically clear. Lowe could not go back. He had crossed a line that the maritime world of the early 18th century drew with particular firmness. You did not raise a weapon against your captain, not, and expect to remain free or alive. He and the 12 men who chose to follow him took the longboat and departed. And in that small wooden vessel, on that warm Central American water, something crystallized. He had been dismissed from ordinary life once already by grief. Now he had dismissed himself from it entirely, by choice and by impulse. There was nothing left to return to. The only question remaining was what direction to sail. The answer arrived quickly. Within a day, Lowe and his small band encountered a vessel captained by a man named George Lowther. And here we meet the figure who would serve briefly as Lowe's tutor in the organized practice of piracy. Lowther is a fascinating character in his own right and deserves a moment's consideration. He had been the second mate aboard a ship called the Gambia Castle, operated by the Royal African Company, and he had led a successful mutiny after a prolonged dispute over pay and conditions, a theme that recurs with remarkable consistency among men who ended up flying the black flag. Lowther was intelligent, organized, and by the standards of his profession, relatively measured in his violence. He was, in the language of the time, a pragmatic pirate. He wanted ships. He wanted cargo. He preferred cooperation over confrontation because confrontation was expensive and risky, and sometimes fatal. He was not interested in cruelty for its own sake. He took Lowe aboard. He recognized in this lean, angry man from Westminster a useful energy, a fearlessness that bordered on indifference to consequence, which in the piracy business was genuinely valuable. Lowe rose quickly within Lowther's crew. He was made quartermaster. He was given responsibility, and he exercised it with a competence that suggested, as it so often does with gifted and destructive people, that the capabilities were always there. They had simply been waiting for the right or the wrong environment to flourish. The two men raided together along the eastern seaboard of North America through 1721 and into 1722, taking vessels off the Carolinas, Virginia, and the waters around Newfoundland. It was during these early raids that Lowe began to reveal, in increments, the particular character of his violence, where Lowther preferred swift, business-like takeovers. Take the cargo, release the crew, move on. Lowe showed a persistent interest in what happened after the cargo was secured. He asked questions of captains. He administered punishment for answers he didn't like. He seemed, to those who sailed with him and later described those early days, to find in the act of domination over captured men something that went beyond professional necessity. The partnership ended in the spring of 1722. The precise cause of the split varies depending on which account you read, but the shape of it is consistent. Lowe had outgrown the arrangement. Whether Lowther was unwilling to accommodate the escalating nature of Lowe's behavior, or whether Lowe simply decided he wanted his own command, the result was the same. Lowe took a schooner the crew had recently captured, gathered around 40 men who were willing to follow him, and departed. He was now, for the first time, his own captain. The vessel he commanded was small, a two-masted schooner, nimble and fast, well suited to the kind of work he intended to do. He renamed her, appointed officers, drew up articles, as was the custom, the formal codes of conduct that pirate crews operated under, which were, in their way, surprisingly democratic documents. Pirate ships were not the lawless chaos of popular imagination. They had rules. They had systems for distributing plunder, for compensating the injured, for resolving disputes. They were, in a dark and inverted sense, functioning societies. Lowe understood this. He was not an unintelligent man. He knew that a crew needed structure, and he provided it. What he also provided, with increasing frequency, was spectacle. His first significant independent action came off the coast of New England in the summer of 1722, when he took a series of vessels in rapid succession, fishing boats, small merchant ships, the workhorses of the coastal trade. Most captains, upon seeing the black flag, made the rational calculation and surrendered without resistance. And for those who surrendered quickly and cooperated fully, Lowe could be almost reasonable. He took what he wanted. He sometimes returned vessels to their crews. He occasionally even left provisions. But for those who resisted, or who were believed to have concealed cargo, or who simply, and this is the part that troubled observers most, seemed to have irritated him in some way he couldn't quite articulate, The experience was something else entirely. He was creative in his punishments in a way that went well beyond deterrence. Deterrence has a logic to it. You hurt one man so that the next man cooperates. What Lowe did often had no obvious logic. It seemed, to those who witnessed it and survived to describe it, almost recreational. A Portuguese captain, in one early and widely reported incident, threw a bag of gold coins overboard rather than surrender it to Lowe. The response was disproportionate, in a way that announced something important about this new captain's nature. Lowe did not simply punish the man. He punished him elaborately, with evident attention to detail, and made sure that the crew of the captured vessel, and by extension, every sailor who later heard the story in a tavern or a harbor, understood exactly what the cost of defiance looked like. The story spread. Stories like that always do. And something interesting began to happen along the Atlantic seaboard. Edward Lowe, who had been nobody, who had spent years in the shipyards and the logwood camps and the longboats of the world, became a name. A name said quietly and with care, in the way that people say the names of things they do not want to summon. He was not yet at the height of his infamy. That was still ahead, the worst of it. The acts that would make his name synonymous with a particular species of darkness, even among men who were themselves violent and feared, had not yet occurred. He was still, in the summer of 1722, assembling himself, finding his range, discovering, voyage by voyage, just how far he was willing to go. As it would turn out, the answer was considerably further than anyone around him had imagined. There is a particular quality to the fear that Edward Lowe generated, and it is worth pausing to understand it properly before we move into the events themselves. Because fear, in the maritime world of the early 18th century, was not uncommon. The sea produced it in abundance: storms, shoals, disease, the ever-present possibility of simply vanishing without explanation into deep water. Pirates, as a category, were frightening. They were a known hazard, like weather. Sailors calculated the risk and sailed anyway, because the alternative was poverty on land, which had its own terrors. What Lowe produced was something different in kind. It was not the generalized fear of pirates as a class. It was a specific, personal dread. The dread of him, of his flag, of the particular knowledge of what his presence meant for the hours that followed. Sailors who had never encountered him knew his methods in detail, because the survivors of his raids talked, and the talking spread, and by the autumn of 1720 his reputation had achieved a kind of critical mass. The name Edward Lowe had weight to it. It landed differently than other names. Understanding why requires understanding what he actually did. And so, with the calm that the distance of 3 centuries affords us, let us look at it carefully. By late 1722, Lowe had moved his operations into the waters around New England and the Canadian maritime coast, rich hunting grounds for a pirate of his ambition, teeming with fishing vessels, coastal traders, and the occasional more substantial prize. He had by this point acquired a larger vessel, a brigantine he named the Fancy, which gave him both greater firepower and greater range. He was operating with a crew of over 100 men. He was, by any professional measure, a successful pirate. His captures numbered in the dozens. His hold was rarely empty. It was off the coast of Nova Scotia, in the summer of 1722, that he encountered a fishing fleet anchored in a harbor. Somewhere in the range of 13 vessels, small and largely defenseless, their crews occupied with the ordinary business of their trade. Lowe descended on them with the efficiency of a man who had been practicing. He took the fleet almost entirely. The fishermen, being fishermen and not soldiers, offered no resistance worth the name, and here Lowe did something that would become characteristic. He was, with some of them, almost generous. He took their catches, their equipment, their more useful provisions. He released most of the men. He even, by several accounts, recruited from among them. not always by force, though the line between invitation and compulsion on a pirate vessel was often a thin one. But among that fleet was a vessel whose captain had made a decision that Lowe found personally offensive. The precise nature of the offense varies in the telling, but the response does not. Lowe made an example of that captain in a manner so disproportionate and deliberate that it was still being recounted in New England ports weeks later, adding new dimensions to a reputation that was already substantial. This was his method, refined over the months of his independent command, overwhelming force applied swiftly to secure compliance, followed by a sorting process, cooperative captains in one category, difficult ones in another. And then, for those in the second category, a performance, because that is what it was, increasingly. Performance. The violence served a communicative function, certainly, but it also served something else, something harder to name, but visible in the accounts of those who witnessed it. Lowe appeared, in these moments, to be engaged, present in a way he perhaps was not at other times. The cruelty was not incidental to him. It was, in some way, that his survivors struggled to articulate, and his historians have struggled to explain, central. In the early months of 1723, he pushed further out into the Atlantic, raiding off the Azores and along the Portuguese coast before sweeping back west. This transatlantic range was unusual for a pirate of his era and demonstrated a confidence or an indifference to risk that set him apart operationally as well as temperamentally. Most pirates of the Golden Age worked defined territories. They had preferred hunting grounds, known harbors, established patterns. Lowe moved constantly, erratically almost, driven by appetite and instinct rather than careful strategic calculation. This made him harder to intercept, and the colonial authorities who were increasingly aware of him found, to their frustration, that by the time intelligence arrived about his location, he was already somewhere else entirely. It was during this period, the first half of 1723, that the most extensively documented incidents of his career occurred. These are the accounts that filled the newspapers of Boston and London, that found their way into Captain Johnson's history, that established Lowe's reputation not merely as a pirate, but as something requiring a different category of description. There was the matter of Captain Graves, whose vessel Lowe took somewhere in the Atlantic in early 1723. Graves had apparently attempted to conceal valuables, or was believed to have done so. The exact circumstances, as with many of these incidents, are filtered through accounts that were recorded after the fact, with all the distortions that memory and terror and the desire to make sense of events can introduce. What the accounts agree on is the nature of what followed. Lowe's response to perceived deception was not simply punitive. It was theatrical and sustained, and it was conducted before an audience of the captured crew with the deliberate intention of being remembered and repeated. Graves survived, which was itself a kind of calculation on Lowe's part. A dead man carries no stories. Then there is the case, perhaps the most widely cited of all, of Captain Auger, or in some accounts, a Portuguese captain whose name the English sources render inconsistently. This captain, upon being taken by Lowe, made the fateful decision to dispose of a quantity of gold rather than surrender it. The gold went overboard, and what Lowe did in response was recorded with a specificity that his contemporaries clearly felt the world needed to know. It involved blades and time, and a patience that was in its own way more disturbing than simple rage would have been. Rage, at least, exhausts itself. What Lowe exhibited was something cooler, more deliberate, a man in full possession of himself, choosing each step. The crews of captured vessels were not uniformly mistreated. This is an important nuance, and it is one that the more careful historians of piracy have taken pains to preserve. Lowe, like most pirates, needed sailors. He recruited constantly, sometimes genuinely, offering men a share of plunder and freedom from the drudgery of merchant service, and sometimes less genuinely, pressing men who would not have chosen the life if other options had remained available. He was not indifferent to usefulness. A skilled navigator, a competent carpenter, a man who knew the waters around a particular coast. These were assets, and Lowe treated assets with a degree of pragmatic care. It was captains, specifically, who bore the heaviest weight of his attention. And within that category, it was captains who had resisted or deceived or displayed what Lowe interpreted as arrogance. The arrogance of a man who believed that rank or respectability offered some protection against him, who fared worst. There was something almost ideological in this targeting, if ideology is not too grand a word for it. Lowe had spent his life on the wrong side of the ledger, in the debt column of a society that organized itself rigorously around wealth and status. The captains of merchant vessels were not wealthy men by the standards of the London drawing rooms Lowe had grown up adjacent to, but they were men of relative authority, men who gave orders, men who expected deference. Lowe, given the chance, reversed that arrangement, and he seemed to find in that reversal something that functioned, for him, like satisfaction. By the summer of 1723, the colonial authorities of New England had elevated the pursuit of Lowe to a genuine priority. HMS Greyhound, a Royal Navy vessel specifically tasked with the suppression of piracy in the region, was operating in the waters where Lowe was known to hunt. And in June of that year, she found him. Or rather, found his consort vessel, a ship called the Ranger, commanded by Lowe's associate Charles Harris, while Lowe himself sailed nearby in the Fancy. What happened next revealed something about Lowe's character that his violence, paradoxically, had partially obscured. When the Greyhound engaged, Lowe ran. He left Harris and the Ranger to their fate, and their fate was capture, trial, and execution for the majority of the crew. Harris himself was hanged in Newport, Rhode Island, along with 25 of his men, in July of 1723, in one of the largest mass pirate executions in American colonial history. Lowe escaped. He was not caught. And this is significant not merely as a biographical fact, but as a psychological one. He had abandoned his consort. He had sailed away from men who had sailed with him, fought with him, organized their lives around the same dangerous enterprise, the code of the pirate articles. Those democratic documents he had drawn up with such apparent seriousness implied a kind of mutual commitment. Lowe, when tested, demonstrated that his commitments extended precisely as far as his personal safety. He was alive. Harris was dead, and Lowe, somewhere on the open Atlantic, in the summer of 1723, turned his ship and continued. He was not finished, not remotely. The abandonment of Harris seems to have produced in him, if anything, a kind of acceleration, as though the brush with the Navy and the calculation it had required had loosened something further. The months that followed would contain some of the worst documented incidents of his career. The Atlantic was wide, and Edward Lowe was still in it. There is a threshold in the study of historical violence beyond which the academic instinct, to contextualize, to explain, to find the structural forces at work, begins to feel not merely insufficient but faintly dishonest. We can talk about the golden age of piracy as a product of its economic conditions, and that is true. We can talk about Lowe's childhood in Westminster, his grief, his class resentments, and that is true as well. We can note that the Atlantic world of the early 18th century was saturated with violence, that naval punishment was brutal, that the slave trade was operating at full capacity just over the horizon from every ship Lowe ever sailed past, and that the entire edifice of colonial commerce was built on coercion. All of that is true, and none of it is irrelevant. But at a certain point, the explanations must step back. And what remains when they do is simply the record. What Edward Lowe did to specific people in specific places in the months following his abandonment of Charles Harris and the crew of the Ranger. We owe those people, at minimum, the honesty of looking at it directly. He had pushed east again, back into the waters of the mid-Atlantic, hunting the shipping lanes that connected Europe to the Americas, and that, in the summer and autumn of 1723, were moving with their usual commercial regularity, largely unaware that Lowe was among them. He had a new consort vessel by this point, having lost the Ranger to the Greyhound, and his crew, though somewhat reduced by the events of June, remained substantial. He was operational. He was angry, in the particular sustained way that seems to have been his baseline state, and he was, if the accounts of the period are to be believed, drinking heavily, which in a man of Lowe's temperament was not a moderating influence. The autumn of 1723 produced a series of captures that were documented with unusual thoroughness, partly because the survivors were numerous enough and the incidents lurid enough that colonial newspapers on both sides of the Atlantic treated them as news worthy of careful record. It is from this period that the most frequently cited and the most disturbing episodes of Lowe's career are drawn. There was the capture of the merchant vessel whose captain, a man named Captain Tompkins in some sources, made the error of speaking to Lowe with what Lowe perceived as insufficient humility. The precise words exchanged were not recorded, which is perhaps just as well. What was recorded is what followed. Lowe, who had been in a deteriorating mood for days according to crewmen who later gave testimony, responded to the captain's manner with a methodical violence that took the better part of an evening to complete and that left the surviving crew members, held on deck, unable to intervene or look away, in a state that several of them later described, with the limited psychological vocabulary of their era, as something close to shock. They used words like stupefied, benumbed. One man, giving testimony in a Boston court some months later, said simply that he had not known before that night what a man was capable of. But it is the incident involving Captain John Estwick, or possibly Massey. The names in different sources are frustratingly inconsistent. That has become the most cited single act of Lowe's career, and that cemented, once and for all, his reputation as something beyond the ordinary scale of pirate violence. The vessel was taken somewhere in the waters between the Azores and the Carolina coast in the late summer or early autumn of 1723. The captain, by most accounts, was a calm and steady man who made no particular effort at resistance and no attempt to conceal his cargo. He cooperated, in other words, in precisely the way that Lowe's reputation recommended. He did everything correctly, and Lowe, apparently in the grip of one of the black moods that his crew had learned to recognize and dread, decided that cooperation was insufficient grounds for mercy. The captain's lips were cut from his face. This was done while he was alive. Lowe then had them cooked. The accounts specify this with a matter-of-factness that is itself disturbing, and forced the captain to eat them, telling him with the gallows humor that he apparently deployed even in his worst moments, that the man might as well eat heartily, as there was precious little else available for supper. The captain died of his injuries. Lowe moved on. This story appears in multiple independent sources. It is not the invention of a single sensationalizing pamphleteer. Captain Johnson includes it. Trial records reference incidents of similar character. It was known, spoken of, and believed by the maritime communities of the Atlantic world while Lowe was still at large. It is, by any measure, an act that resists explanation through the usual frameworks. There is no strategic logic to it. There is no communicative function that required that specific form. It was not a message. It was not deterrence. It was something else. And the something else is what has kept historians and readers returning to Edward Lowe for 3 centuries, searching for an answer that the record declines to provide. He was not, during this period, entirely without a coherent self-image. This is worth noting because it complicates the easy categorization of Lowe as simply a madman, a label that is both clinically meaningless in this context and historically evasive. Lowe had a code of sorts. He had positions he disliked, with a fervor that several accounts describe as genuine, the captains of slave ships. And there is a particular irony in this, given that the trade he professed to despise was also one of the economic engines of the Atlantic world he was simultaneously robbing. He had views on loyalty, though his own practice of it, as the abandonment of Harris had demonstrated, was situational at best. He was contemptuous of cowardice, in others, if conspicuously not always in himself. And he had, strangely, a sentimental streak. There are accounts, and they are credible enough to be repeated in serious historical treatments, of Lowe encountering vessels whose crews included men he had some prior connection to, former acquaintances, men from his Boston years, sailors he recognized from earlier in his career, and releasing them with not merely their lives, but their possessions intact. There is an account of him weeping in his cups over the daughter he had left behind in Boston, the daughter whose mother's death had, perhaps, set all of this in motion. He carried her, in some form, with him on every ship he ever commanded, and then he would sober up, and the next vessel would appear on the horizon, and whatever softness had briefly surfaced would submerge again beneath the weight of who he had become. The crew who sailed with him in this final intense period of his documented career were not, it should be said, entirely passive instruments. Pirate crews were not armies. They had voices, votes, the right under their articles to weigh in on decisions, and the record suggests that some among Lowe's crew were genuinely disturbed by the extremity of his behavior, not from any particular moral elevation, but from the practical recognition that the kind of notoriety Lowe was generating made their collective situation significantly more dangerous. When a pirate captain becomes famous enough that naval vessels are specifically tasked with finding him, the crew shares in the consequences of that fame. There were, by several accounts, internal tensions aboard the Fancy in the months following the worst incidents of the autumn. Men who had signed on for robbery and had found themselves witness to something they had not contracted for. The democratic mechanisms of the pirate articles were, in theory, available to them. A crew could, and sometimes did, depose a captain whose behavior endangered the enterprise. But Lowe inspired in his crew a particular quality of fear that was not entirely separable from the fear he inspired in his victims. He was unpredictable in his fury, in a way that made confronting him feel like a calculation with too many unknown variables. Better to endure, and hope that the mood lifted. Better to be somewhere else when the black descended. In early 1724, he took a vessel carrying a cargo that included, depending on which source you consult, either medicinal supplies or commercial goods, somewhere off the western coast of the Atlantic. The captain of this vessel made no resistance and surrendered everything asked of him with admirable speed. Lowe, in an unusually measured response, took the cargo and prepared to release the vessel. One of his own crewmen, the accounts differ on who exactly, made a remark that Lowe interpreted as criticism of his handling of the situation. Whether it was the manner in which the remark was delivered, or the content of it, or simply the fact that Lowe's patience for even the mildest friction had been wearing thin for months, the response was immediate and severe. He turned the violence, in that moment, on his own crew. This was a line. In the culture of piracy, with its articles and its rough democracy, violence against your own men without the sanction of collective judgment was a serious transgression. It was the kind of act that could fracture a crew entirely. And in the weeks that followed this incident, something did indeed fracture. The precise sequence of events is unclear, as it is for much of Lowe's final period, but what the sources collectively suggest is that his crew, or a portion of it, had reached a limit, whether through formal vote or informal conspiracy, or simple mass desertion at the next available opportunity, Lowe found himself, at some point in the first months of 1724, with a significantly diminished command. Some accounts suggest he was set adrift by his own crew, cast off in a small boat with a handful of loyalists, a fate that had its own grim poetry for a man who had built his career on dominating others. The image of Edward Lowe, who had terrorized hundreds of men across hundreds of thousands of miles of ocean, sitting in a longboat on the open Atlantic while his former crew sailed away, is one that history seems almost to have designed for the purposes of a particular kind of moral satisfaction: the abandoned man, the consumed, consuming himself. Other accounts place him in the hands of a French vessel shortly thereafter. Some say he was tried and hanged in Martinique, the French authorities dispensing a justice that the English colonial courts had not managed to administer. Others say the French vessel's account is unreliable, that Lowe survived this too, that he disappears not into a noose, but simply into the vast, indifferent ocean, alive and unaccounted for, which in its own way is a more unsettling ending. What can be said with confidence is that by 1724, Edward Lowe had ceased to appear in any verified historical record. The raids stopped. The survivor testimonies stopped. The newspapers stopped printing his name with that peculiar mixture of horror and fascination that had characterized their coverage of him for 2 years. He was gone, and the Atlantic, which had hosted his violence without comment, continued its business. 3 centuries later, we are left with the record, with the names of captains who encountered him and did not survive, with the testimony of men who stood on the decks of captured ships and watched things happen that they could not find adequate words for, with the mystery of a man who moved through the world with such concentrated destructive energy and then simply ceased, leaving no confirmed grave, no final scene, no satisfying resolution. He remains, in the literature of the golden age of piracy, a figure unto himself, not romanticized, as Blackbeard has been, not celebrated, as Bartholomew Roberts sometimes is, for his operational brilliance, simply recorded with the careful unease of people who understood that they were documenting something that defied their available categories. The sea keeps its secrets, and Edward Lowe was among the deepest of them. Every life, no matter how violent, no matter how abbreviated or unresolved, leaves a shape in the world. Not always a monument, not always a lesson, neatly extracted and applied. Sometimes the shape is simply an absence, a space where something happened that the surrounding air has not quite forgotten, even after 300 years. Edward Lowe left that kind of shape, and in the long aftermath of his disappearance from the historical record, what has grown up around that shape is a combination of genuine scholarly inquiry, lurid popular fascination, and a series of unanswered questions that resist, with almost deliberate stubbornness, any final resolution. We begin with the mystery of his end, because it is where history itself begins to fray. The most commonly repeated account of Lowe's final chapter places him, sometime in 1724, in the custody of a French warship or naval vessel operating in the Caribbean. The sequence, as reconstructed from fragmentary sources, goes something like this. His crew, having reached the collective breaking point that the events of early 1724 had apparently precipitated, set him adrift. Him and a small number of men who remained loyal, or who simply had nowhere else to go. The longboat drifted. And then, by the particular caprice that the ocean sometimes exercises over the fates of men who have spent their lives upon it, a French vessel found him. What happened next depends entirely on which source you trust. One account places him on trial in Martinique, the French colonial authorities proceeding with the efficiency that their legal system, considerably less burdened by the evidentiary requirements of English common law, was capable of. Tried, convicted, hanged, a clean ending, if not a witnessed one. The problem is that no French colonial record from Martinique in 1724 has ever been produced that confirms a trial and execution matching Lowe's description. This absence is not conclusive. Colonial record-keeping of the period was inconsistent, and records that did exist have not always survived the intervening centuries. But it is enough to keep the question open. Another account suggests that the French vessel's crew, upon discovering who they had pulled from the water, decided that the formality of a trial was unnecessary. That Lowe was hanged from the yardarm at sea, summarily, which was within the accepted practice of the era for convicted pirates caught in the act. This would explain the absence of court records. It would also be a fitting, if brutal, conclusion for a man who had spent 2 years operating entirely outside the frameworks of law and judgment that the societies around him maintained. And then there are the accounts, smaller in number but persistent, that Lowe was not captured by the French at all. That the longboat story is either invention or embellishment. That Lowe, who had demonstrated throughout his career a remarkable talent for survival, found his way to a shore somewhere, assumed a different name, and lived out whatever years remained to him in the anonymous quiet that the Atlantic world, with its vast and porous edges, was quite capable of providing to a man sufficiently motivated to disappear. No one has ever found evidence of this either. It remains a speculation, but it is a speculation with a certain internal logic. Lowe had survived things that should have killed him before: the Greyhound, the desertion of Harris, the fracturing of his own crew. A man of that particular resilience might well have survived his own legend. We simply do not know. And there is something appropriate in that. A man who generated so much chaos leaving behind him. At the last, not a confirmed grave, but a question mark. What we can assess with considerably more confidence is his legacy, and what that legacy reveals about the world that produced him. Within the literature of the golden age of piracy, a period historians generally bracket between roughly 6080 and 730, the Lowe occupies a specific and somewhat uncomfortable position. The Golden Age has, over the centuries, accumulated a considerable romantic mythology. Pirates, in the popular imagination, are figures of freedom and rebellion, men who rejected the hierarchies of the legitimate world, who built their own floating democracies, who thumbed their noses at kings and companies alike. There is genuine historical substance beneath this romance. The pirate articles really were democratic documents. Pirate crews really did, on occasion, include men of multiple races operating under conditions of relative equality that the legitimate maritime world of the period would not have recognized. Bartholomew Roberts really was an extraordinarily capable commander. The romance is not entirely fabricated, but Lowe sits at the edge of that romance and declines to participate in it. He cannot be pressed into the service of the freedom narrative, because the freedom he exercised was indistinguishable, from the perspective of his victims, from pure predation. The democratic articles he drew up coexisted, on his ships, with a personal tyranny that the articles were theoretically designed to prevent. He was the argument against romanticizing pirates, the reminder that the rejection of legitimate authority does not automatically produce anything better, and can produce something considerably worse. Captain Johnson, whose general history of the pirates remains the foundational text for anyone studying this period, understood this. His treatment of Lowe is notably different in tone from his treatment of other pirates, where he finds, in figures like Roberts or even Blackbeard, room for a certain narrative generosity. The capable commander, the theatrical villain, the man who might have been something else under different circumstances. His Lowe chapters carry a quality of genuine unease. Johnson was not, by temperament, a man easily disturbed. He had written extensively about violent men, but Lowe disturbed him, and the writing shows it. The prose tightens. The anecdotes are delivered with less embellishment than usual, as though Johnson understood that embellishment was unnecessary and possibly counterproductive. The facts, boldly stated, were sufficient. This instinct to let the record speak with minimal decoration has characterized the most serious historical treatments of Lowe in the centuries since. He appears in academic histories of piracy as a kind of limit case, a data point at the extreme end of a distribution. Historians of violence have found him interesting precisely because he does not fit the models that explain most historical violence adequately. He was not ideologically motivated. He was not strategically excessive in the way that calculated terror campaigns are excessive. He was not, as far as the record shows, responding to specific provocations in any consistent way. The violence was, in a clinical sense, disproportionate across the board, not triggered reliably by resistance or deception, not calibrated to achieve specific outcomes, not modulated by the presence or absence of witnesses or consequences, what this suggests to modern readers. And here we venture, carefully, into territory where the historical record meets the frameworks of contemporary psychology. Is a personality structure that the 18th century had no vocabulary to describe, and that even our own era would approach with some caution. The impulsivity, the apparent incapacity for what might be called proportional response, the targeting of authority figures with a specific and elaborated ferocity, the moments of unexpected sentiment coexisting with the extremity of the violence. These are not the profile of a man simply brutalized by his environment and replicating that brutality outward. They suggest something more innate and more intractable. But we should be careful not to reduce Edward Lowe to a clinical category. He was a man of his time, shaped by forces that were real and that operated on millions of people who did not become what he became. The poverty of Westminster was real. The grief of losing Eliza was real. The hierarchies of the maritime world, which ground down ordinary men with a thoroughness that the historical record documents extensively, were real. Lowe did not emerge from a vacuum. He emerged from a world, and the world deserves its share of the accounting. What Lowe tells us about that world, ultimately, is something about its edges, about what happened to men who fell off the ledger entirely. Men for whom the legitimate structures of society had failed so comprehensively and so early that the structures themselves ceased to have any operative meaning. The law, for Lowe, was not a framework he had ever meaningfully benefited from. The church, the courts, the hierarchies of commerce and rank, these were systems he had observed from the outside, systems that organized the lives of people who had something to protect and something to lose. Lowe had lost everything he cared about before he was 30, and in that loss, the systems lost their grip on him. This is not a justification. It is a diagnosis of a particular social failure, the failure to provide any sufficient foothold to a significant class of men in the Atlantic world of the early 18th century. Men who were useful when they were needed and disposable when they were not. Men who built the ships and crewed the vessels and cut the logwood and were expected, in return, to accept their condition without producing Edward Lowe's. Most of them did accept it. Most of them endured and worked and died in relative obscurity, and the system noted their passing without ceremony. Lowe did not accept it, and the system noted his passing with 100 newspaper articles and a chapter in every serious history of the era. There is a final irony in that, and it is not a comfortable one. He wanted, we think, to be felt, to matter in a world that had given him very little evidence that he did. The violence was, among other things, a form of insistence. I am here. I am real. You will not ignore me. You will not manage me. You will not dispose of me quietly. He achieved that insistence. He is still being written about, still being read about, still generating the particular quality of uneasy attention that he seems to have craved. 300 years after his disappearance into whatever obscurity or noose or open ocean claimed him, his name still carries weight. Whether that constitutes a legacy worth having is a question each reader must settle for themselves. What it constitutes, beyond any question, is a record of a man, of a world, of what the world produced when it ground certain men down to nothing and then expressed surprise at what crawled out of the wreckage. The Atlantic that Edward Lowe sailed is the same Atlantic. The water has not changed. The shipping lanes he hunted are roughly where they were, and somewhere beneath those cold miles of water, or in some unmarked plot of Caribbean soil, or perhaps, just perhaps, in the unremarkable grave of a man who gave a false name and lived quietly and told no one what he had once been. Edward Lowe came to his end. We do not know where. We do not know when exactly. We do not know whether, in whatever final hours he had, there was anything resembling reflection or regret, or simply the animal insistence on survival that had carried him this far. The ocean keeps its counsel, the record closes, and we are left, as we so often are with history's darkest figures, holding the facts in one hand and the mystery in the other, and finding that neither alone is quite enough.